Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday, July 5, 2024, meaning that our nation just celebrated its 248th birthday. I was thinking about that yesterday and it dawned on me. 2 more years and we have our 250th. Now, I was kind of young, but I was around and adult, so to speak, when we had our bicentennial in 1976. So I remember all the hullabaloo around that, and probably at 250, that was the bicentennial. I don't know what they, bisesquicentennial. I'm not sure what they're going to call it. I'm sure we'll hear before long when they start talking about it when it comes closer. And there is a hurricane in the Gulf. It has hit the islands. It has hit Mexico, and now they say, even though it's down to a Category 2, it's headed for Texas. That's Hurricane Beryl. The B meaning it's the second named storm of the season. I guess they're using female names on the odd ones, or the even ones this year instead of the odd ones. I think they alternate every year. One year they start with male, next year they start with female. When I was younger, they were all named after women. And
Were you told why?
huh?
Were you told why?
No, I remember reading a joke once. They ought to start naming the storms after the men. If they named them after the men, they'd never make it past the Virgin Islands.
Um, Somebody asked one of our teachers once, how come they all have girls' names? And her response from a female teacher was because women are more tempestuous than men.
Hmm. I doubt that. I seriously doubt that. She didn't know a lot of men, probably. Anyway,
Maybe she was speaking for herself.
could be. I don't know. Well, there was at some point a decision made to not always name them after women. I think in part because they were running out of names to use.
Well, it's sexist to do that.
Well, they don't anymore. They name them after women and men. When when I had firsthand experience with a hurricane, it was Hurricane Camille back in 1969. Um, I was at the boarding school. Well, the official address was Lumberton, but the school was closer to Purvis than it was to Lumberton. That's in Mississippi. And the hurricane hit, and it was wide enough that it hit New Orleans and the Mississippi coast. And I think there was even some damage over toward Mobile. I know pretty much all of the Mississippi coast was damaged. Um, I was at the boarding school, but my dad came through with the conference truck to take relief supplies down to the coast, and he took me with him for a couple of days. We spent the night at a coastal church, and that was the time when they had all the preachers out in the yard drinking out of Budweiser cans, because in that area the hurricane had polluted all the drinking water supplies. So the only way they could get drinking water was to have it canned and brought in, and the breweries agreed to produce water and can it and send it. But they used the cans they had, which was their own cans, and so there were all these preachers standing in the front yard of the church drinking out of Budweiser cans. I think somebody got a picture of it just for the effect. Anyway, I forget the category of Camille when it came ashore. I think it might have been category 4. In fact, why don't I see if I can look that up? I might be able to search that real quick. Camille ranks as the second most intense hurricane to strike the continental U.S. with 900 millibars pressure and a landfall intensity of 150 knots. This is from the National Weather Service. Camille ranks just below the 1935 Labor Day hurricane with 892 millibars and 160 knots. Now, millibars is a thousandth of a bar. Bar is normal barometric pressure. So the lower the number, the more intense the storm. So Camille was 900, and the Labor Day hurricane in 35, that's quite a few years ago, was 882 millibars, 160 knots, 10 knots faster than Camille. While slightly stronger than Hurricane Andrew with 922 millibars and 145 knots, and Hurricane Michael with 919 millibars and 140 knots. The actual maximum sustained winds of Hurricane Camille are not known, as the hurricane destroyed all the wind recording instruments in the landfall area. Reanalysis data found peak winds of 150 knots, that's roughly 175 miles per hour along the coast. A devastating storm tide of 24.6 feet occurred west of our area in Pass Christian, Mississippi. So it looks like it came up from the south, brushed the end of Cuba, and then made landfall in the western portion of the Mississippi notch that comes down to the coast, because Mississippi is considerably wider than its coastal area. So it was close to New Orleans, and anyway.
Yeah, I'm thinking no wonder my son's grandmother got so upset when the hurricane was headed for the Texas coast while we were living in San Antonio. She had been there during Camille, in Mississippi during Camille.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought you were going to tell the rest of that story.
No, I'll spare her that.
Okay, well, anyway.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah, well, that's, I think we're prepared to just go ahead and get started with tonight's study. We are reading from the book of Exodus. We're ready for chapter 11. We have been covering the plagues on Egypt, the first, of course, being the Nile River and all the water in Egypt turning to blood for a few days. Then there were frogs, lice, flies, disease, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness. And now we are ready to go on to Exodus chapter 11. If I can find my mouse cursor and switch scenes here. And so before we begin, let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for giving us all the blessings that you give to us, and protection and life and even things to make us glad and happy and to find life enjoyable. We know that you intended us to have joyful, abundant lives, and that when we don't, that's a result of other people's missteps and ultimately the sin which took place when our parents believed the deceiver's lies and lost their trust and lost their love. Lies believed destroy the cycle of love and trust. What was the word I couldn't come up with?
Lies believed break the circle.
Break the cycle of love and trust, yes. We
Cycle.
want to have our love and trust in you restored, and that's why we take time to open the written word. We ask that the Holy Spirit will come now to give us individually a clear understanding of what we cover. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. Had a little blockage there all of a sudden. I couldn't think of the word. Lies believed break the cycle of love and trust. And that's what happened there in Eden. Anyway.
Well, you'll be 50 on your next birthday. I think it allowed to have a little brain blip.
What were you saying about my next birthday?
You'll be 50.
50? That's generous.
I love you.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we've got chapter 11 up here, and let's scroll down a bit and get more of it on screen. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will strike Pharaoh and the land of Egypt with one more blow. After that, Pharaoh will let you leave this country. Now, when the quotation is, I will strike, that's based in part on the Hebrew approach to life. That, if it happened, God did it. So if Pharaoh and Egypt got struck, then God did it. So they give that, and God takes responsibility for the things that he allows. So he might actually say to Moses, given Moses' understanding, I will strike. But we are about to find out what this text has to reveal about who's been doing all these things to Egypt. After that, Pharaoh will let you leave this country. In fact, he will be so eager to get rid of you that he will force you all to leave. Tell all the Israelite men and women to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. Now, the Lord had caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the people of Israel, and Moses was considered a very great man in the land of Egypt, respected by Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people alike. Moses had announced to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, at midnight tonight I will pass through the heart of Egypt. All the firstborn sons will die in every family in Egypt, from the oldest son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the oldest son of his lowliest servant girl who grinds the flour. Even the firstborn of all the livestock will die. Then a loud wail will rise throughout the land of Egypt, a wail like no one has heard before or will ever hear again. But among the Israelites it will be so peaceful that not even a dog will bark. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Now that last sentence there is out of character for God, because we read in the New Testament that God does not play favorites. But the Old Testament is the history of God playing favorites with the people of Israel, the descendants of Jacob. God favored them. God blessed them. God treated them better than their neighbors. And he's saying so right here that he's doing that. Then you will know that the Lord, Yahweh, makes a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Now, how are we to understand that? How can God be, in the Old Testament, so particular, well, not particular, but so discriminating that he would favor one group of people over everybody else, And then in the New Testament, we find out that God does not play favorites.
Could it be a case of acting to protect somebody who's being abused?
Well, certainly that's going on here, but if that were the case, wouldn't God act to free all the slaves in the world and make an end to slavery in the world back there 1500 years before Christ? Well, we know that didn't happen because slavery happened in our own country. Uh, roughly 150 years ago, 160 now.
Hey, I remember hearing a news story on NPR when we were living in Rochester. Slavery's still a thing.
Oh, sure. It's not officially sanctioned, but yes, it's still a thing, even here in the United States, but definitely so in other countries. My understanding is that, and I base this in part on what we read in the book of Zechariah, and of course then understanding how God dealt with people in the New Testament when he no longer made a distinction. God knew at this time, and even before he chose Abraham, that a plan to bring salvation to the world through a chosen people would ultimately fail. That the only part of the plan that would work is that through that people he could bring his son into the world in order to demonstrate what love looked like in human flesh. That could not have happened without at least an outwardly protected people group, which is what he did with the people of Israel. That's the only part of the plan that worked. Nothing else worked. The people failed. And I believe God wanted to demonstrate to the rest of the world and to the universe what kind of approach to dealing with people would not work. Sorry, I was trying to read the title on a book over there. That's what I thought it was. I was looking for that book, and there it is right there on the shelf.
Right in front of you?
Yeah. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts.
Huh?
I was asking you where that book was. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts.
Yeah.
There it is on the shelf, right next to the Complete Guide to Gardening.
Well, that doesn't belong there.
No, but I think
I had those books.
I think I was.
Grouped by subject.
Yeah. Well, I think what happened was I was cleaning up in this room, and I wanted a place to put it, and I looked at the bookshelf, and that was a spot where there was an opening, so I put it there. And then I forgot I did it.
Never lost.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not lost. I know where it is now. And the other book that we got kind of along with that was the Something Keeps the Score. Is it The Body Keeps the Score?
Score.
You got muffled. I couldn't hear it.
The Body Keeps the Score.
Okay, yeah, I know where that is. That's in the other room. Those two kind of go together. Anyway. So that's what I think is going on in the story of Israel, and we'll have opportunity to talk more about it, because the other thing that I think God intended to do here was to give us a metaphor of salvation. And he told Rebekah, the elder will serve the younger. That would mean that the elder would be greater than the younger, because in heaven's way of doing things, the greater serve the lesser. That's the way it works. God serves all of the universe. It says in the Psalms, the eyes of all wait upon thee, and thou givest them their food in due season. I'm quoting sort of from the King James there, because that's...
One thing that therapists will tell their patients when patients are depressed,
Yeah.
acts of benevolence.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do them, it tends to make you feel better. It lifts your mood.
Yeah.
So there's something about doing acts for others that is built into us.
Yeah.
It's what we were created to do.
Anyway, the point I was getting to there was that I think God intended for his chosen people to have an experience of bondage from which he would then deliver them as this opening act in the metaphor of salvation. That when God intends to save us individually, when we open our lives to him, when we trust him enough and allow him to take over, the first thing that he has to do to deal with us is to set us free from the bondage of our own disease and sickness. And that's the experience that he's about to give Israel in this story. And it doesn't, knowing the characters of the two brothers, it is not difficult to imagine that had Rebekah allowed her husband to give the blessing to the older son as he intended, to Esau, that the descendants of those two men would at some point come to odds enough that the manipulative, deceitful descendants of Jacob might take the descendants of Esau captive, and then God could act to free them. And had that happened, things might have gone a little bit differently. When the people of Israel served their bondage in Egypt, they learned idolatry. And idolatry was a problem from the time they left Egypt until they got taken away captive to Babylon roughly 1,000 years later. That might not have happened had Rebekah not made the choice that she made. But God let it happen because God grants the human race freedom and lets us get what we want, even sometimes when that's not so good for us. Reading on, starting now at verse 8. All the officials of Egypt will run to me and fall to the ground before me. Please leave, they will beg. Hurry and take all your followers with you. Only then will I go. Then, burning with anger, Moses left Pharaoh. Now, the Lord had told Moses earlier, Pharaoh will not listen to you, but then I will do even more mighty miracles in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed these miracles in Pharaoh's presence, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let the Israelites leave the country. And we have talked about that language before, because in different places it renders that differently. Pharaoh hardened his heart was hardened, or the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we believe that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart in the sense that he brought Pharaoh to a decision point where Pharaoh would then have to make up his own mind about whether he would let Israel go, and that Pharaoh made the choice he made freely based on his own character and inclinations and the political pressure on him, etc., etc. But the political pressure is beginning to turn, as we can see up here in verse 3. The Lord had caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the people of Israel, and Moses was considered a very great man in the land of Egypt, respected by Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people alike. So I think we're seeing the political tide turn in Egypt against Pharaoh, which is ultimately, I think, going to force his hand, although we know not entirely. Exodus 12. While the Israelites were still in the land of Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. From now on, this month will be the first month of the year for you. And we believe that this was probably on about March, our month. And one of the reasons for that is that was so much the monthly cycle that even the modern English names for months hold March to be roughly the first month. Now, we don't see that numbering naming until we get past August. July and August, we're in July right now, are named after Julius and Augustus, Roman Caesars or emperors, who thought they were so great that they got to name months after themselves, and they did. And of course, you may be aware that after Julius got his month, which had 31 days, Augustus got the next month, which only had 30 days, and he didn't like that his month had fewer days than his predecessor, so he took a day from the shortest month on the calendar, a day that had a month that had only had 30 days in leap years. So now, instead of having 29 or 30 days, February has 28 or 29 days. Anyway, after August, you have September, S-E-P-T, for the number 7. Then you have October, O-C-T, for the number 8. Then you have November, N-O-V, for the number 9. And finally, December, D-E-C, as in decade, for 10. So the names of our months still suggest that the first month is March. It's only due to Roman tradition that we have made January, after their god Janus, which looked both ways, to be the first month of the year. And somehow the names still retain that 7, 8, 9, and 10 numbering in the name of the month. So, verse 2 again, from now on this month will be the first month of the year for you. Announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice, one animal for each household. If a family is too small to eat a whole animal, let them share with another family in the neighborhood. Divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or a goat, with no defects. And what we are reading here are some of the precursors to the entire system of animal sacrifice that was a big feature of Hebrew worship throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. And we have suggested in the past that this was founded in part on a human thing and is not necessarily God's idea. It's just God using a human tradition to teach and to provide a metaphor for the ministry of Jesus.
He reaches out to us at the level that we can comprehend.
Yeah. And he uses the things that are big and important to us to help teach us. And the reason I got into that is because in verse 5 here it says that the animal must have no defects. In the Hebrew sacrificial system, there should not be any broken bones in the animal. They did not slaughter an animal by crashing in its skull like we tend to do in our slaughterhouses in the United States. In fact, they were specifically, because these were food animals and most of the sacrificial animals were used as food, they were instructed to slit the animal's throat and to drain its blood before they butchered it for food. And we can talk about that when we get to those specifications in the book of Leviticus.
Let me know in advance.
Why?
I don't want to hear about animal killing.
Well, I understand, yeah. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of this first month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. Or I think the King James uses the terminology, the doorposts and the lintel being the part that crosses the post and makes the opening that holds up the roof, or holds up the remainder of the wall and the roof above the doorway. Here it's just saying the sides and top of the door frames, perhaps because they believed that lintel was not a term. I guess if you're not a contractor, you don't know that term as clearly as people who work with building houses and who know what a lintel is. That same night they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. And that's just terminology for the unleavened bread. I guess most modern versions feel that modern people don't understand the term unleavened clearly enough, so they say made without yeast. But unleavened means not just yeast, but any other leavening agent, because we do have a compound based on bicarbonate of soda, but that contains other ingredients that we use as a leavening agent. We call it baking powder. And you can put that in, and as it's baked, it produces carbon dioxide and produces gases that make the dough that you put it in rise when you bake it.
I'm hungry for biscuit.
Sorry about that.
I can't eat biscuits.
Well, at least not the typical kind of biscuit. We might be able to figure out a recipe for biscuits using almond and coconut flour.
Well, I bought keto biscuit mix one,
Yeah.
and we liked it. I don't remember where I bought it.
Well, you probably got it on Amazon.
Amazon or Vitacost.
Yeah, she has gotten some things from Vitacost. That's true. Okay, back to verse 8. We read that and we got stuck up there on the bit about made without yeast or the unleavened bread. That same night they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast, or bitter herbs, I think is the term in the King James. Do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over a fire. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. Burn whatever is not eaten before morning. That's quite a meal. And that's why the stipulation was made. Take this yearling animal, slaughter and butcher it, prepare it over fire, roast it, don't boil it, and don't eat it raw. And the whole thing must be eaten. Anything that you don't eat, you have to burn. These are your instructions for eating this meal. Be fully dressed. Footnote A is bind up your loins. All right. Wear your sandals and carry your walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am Yahweh. But the blood on your doorposts will serve as a sign, marking the houses where you are staying. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now, we haven't gotten to the revealing terminology here yet, so it's still talking as if God's going to go through and do the killing.
Yeah, this is one of those cases I would love to be able to read and comprehend the ancient language.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that God is a murderer.
Well, even you wouldn't necessarily. I don't think there's that big a difference between the English and the original language. I think that the Hebrews, particularly at this point in their existence, were in a very spiritually primitive state and totally misunderstood God. We know they still totally misunderstood when Jesus came, because Jesus came as God in human flesh, and they did not recognize him because they didn't know who God was.
Yeah.
And if they didn't know then,
what I'm saying is that I wonder if somehow the translators changed things.
well, it's possible.
Understanding.
It's possible that the manuscripts we have been altered. That's possible. But I think that even Moses himself, who we suggest may have written this down, also had misunderstandings and really thought God was doing these things personally rather than permitting them.
Which would be what I just said, that I think that there's a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
based upon the understanding that it's written down based upon the understanding of, you said possibly Moses, and I said the interpreters.
The
The
translators.
translators. Somebody messed up
Yeah.
because they're representing God in an unloving manner.
Mm-hmm. This is a day to remember. Each year, from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. This is a law for all time. For 7 days, the bread you eat must be made without yeast, must be unleavened. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast from your homes. Anyone who eats bread made with yeast during the 7 days of the festival will be cut off from the community of Israel. And I just want to see that in the NIV because I think I'm used to reading slightly different language in that terminology. Okay, the NIV just says must be cut off from Israel. I thought this is one of those places where it might use the term assembly, but I don't see that it uses that. But we will run into that term assembly and being removed from the assembly uh, frequently as we go through these books of Moses at the beginning of the Old Testament. On the first day of the festival, and again on the seventh day, all the people must observe an official day for holy assembly. No work of any kind may be done on these days except in the preparation of food. Celebrate this festival, which means that probably in that culture that meant the men did absolutely nothing and the women did all the work because they let the women prepare the food. At least in our culture at one point in time, that was the way it was done. You know, among those who celebrated the seventh day as a holy day and called it the Sabbath, on Sabbath the women would fix the food and wash the dishes, and the men would sit in the living room and run their mouths, probably detrimentally. Are you familiar with that tradition?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it
So
carries on today in places.
I have no doubt that it probably does. Celebrate this festival of unleavened bread, for it will remind you that I brought your forces out of the land of Egypt on this very day. This festival will be a permanent law for you. Celebrate this day from generation to generation. The bread you eat must be made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day of the first month until the evening of the 21st day of that month. And by the way, in Jewish practice, even today, Passover is celebrated very similarly. And they actually have a bit of a ritual and ceremony where they remove the yeast from their houses, but they leave one bit of yeast, packet, whatever, in the house. And I think the youngest, or at least the youngest child capable, is tasked with finding and removing that last bit of yeast from the house. That's part of the ritual and celebration that they have. During those 7 days, there must be no trace of yeast in your homes. Anyone who eats anything made with yeast during this week will be cut off from the community of Israel. These regulations apply both to the foreigners living among you and to the native born Israelites. During those days you must not eat anything made with yeast. Wherever you live, eat only bread made without yeast. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel together and said to them, Go, pick out a lamb or a young goat for each of your families and slaughter the Passover animal. Drain the blood into a basin, then take a bundle of hyssop branches and dip it into the blood. Brush the hyssop across the top and sides of the door frames of your houses. And no one may go through the door until morning. For the Lord will pass through the land to strike down the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, the Lord will pass over your home. He will not permit his death angel to enter your house and strike you down. Now, they're calling it death angel there. Let me look in another version. Ha 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 ha! Interesting how it's worded in the NIV. Verse 23. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Pardon me for a moment while I go find King James Version. I recently remembered my wide margin King James Version that my dad bought for me. I don't know, probably for my 26th birthday, 25th or 26th. He took me to one of the book and Bible stores in Grand Rapids, and I picked out a wide margin Bible because I thought I wanted to write a lot of notes in it. Never actually happened. There are some notes in it, but not a lot. At any rate, this is a leather-bound Bible with a more, well, it's genuine leather, and it does hold up a lot better. And I have had it in a case. I'll show it to you here. This is what it kind of looks like. I've had it in a case for quite a number of years, so it isn't worn out like some of the other Bibles I have around. Anyway, we're looking for Exodus chapter 12. I just want to see how that's worded in chapter 12. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your houses to smite you. Now, it might later use the term angel in this narrative, but at that point, the King James and the NIV both say destroyer. And it is this version that has added the interpretation death angel at this point. Who is the destroyer? It's been revealed for us in the book of Revelation. There is the Creator whom we are called on to worship, and there is the destroyer, Abaddon, Apollyon, Hebrew and Greek terms for destroyer.
Isn't it also, I could be wrong, but isn't the destroyer also mentioned in the book of Job?
He is, but not by the term destroyer. His destructive behavior is displayed in the book of Job quite clearly. And then our next question would be, is this destroyer an angel? Isn't that what Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 point to a covering cherub who lost the way and became a destroyer. So, death
So
angel.
I have to butt in right here and say to all the parents out there that have had a child go wrong, and you sit and you wonder, what did I do wrong when raising this kid? And I point out that there is no perfect parent, not even God was successful at parenting.
Yeah.
One of his children became the ultimate destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
And
So-
there was absolutely no reason for it.
Well, of course not. There was nothing wrong with how God created or dealt with the creatures who surround his throne, we call it, his place of residence. And yet that's where sin first arose. Remember, these instructions are a permanent law that you and your descendants must observe forever. When you enter the land the Lord has promised to give you, you will continue to observe this ceremony. Then your children will ask, "What does this ceremony mean?" And you will reply, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, and though he struck the Egyptians, he spared our families." When Moses had finished speaking, all the people bowed down to the ground and worshiped. Now, it might at this point be appropriate to approach the view of atonement that is given as metaphor in this story, because we do see the sacrificial animal as a type or a precursor, a metaphor of Jesus Christ, who died in order to rescue the human race. Where the animal died, and that the proof of it, because the life is in the blood then was sprinkled on the doorposts and lintels. Where that happened, the firstborn lived. Where that did not happen, the firstborn died. And you could even take it as there being a sense that it was a life for a life. The animal's death prevented the death of the firstborn. In the houses where the animal lived, the firstborn died. And God, while it's we would think of it as, although let's face it, if you eat meat, animals would get sacrificed on your behalf, and not nearly as humanely as the Jews would have done it here. While we find killing animals a little bit off-putting, it does serve as a metaphor for the destruction of sin. Sin causes death. And while it may not have been God's ideal approach, the offering of an animal as a sacrifice was a lesson to those who would hear it that sin destroys. Sin causes death. That's just the nature of the way the universe works. That's the way reality works. If you are out of harmony with the way God designed the universe to operate, there's only one result: death.
God does not hate the sinner.
No, he's not out to get the sinner. But if you insist, given the freedom that God granted you, if you insist on going your own way and not being healed, then God will let that happen and you will die.
God does not hate the sinner. He hates the sin.
Exactly.
Because the sin has separated you from the source of life.
Sin destroys what the Creator has made. And so it is an affront to the Creator in that sense, because it destroys what He made, what He cares about, what He loves.
And that's where you need to learn to differentiate between the person and the behavior.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the people of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded through Moses and Aaron. And that night at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the people of Egypt woke up during the night, and loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. There was not a single house where someone had not died. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron during the night. "Get out," he ordered. "Leave my people and take the rest of the Israelites with you. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you said, and be gone. Go, but bless me as you leave." All the Egyptians urged the people of Israel to get out of the land as quickly as possible, for they thought, "We will all die." The Israelites took their bread dough before yeast was added. They wrapped their kneading boards in their cloaks and carried them on their shoulders. And the people of Israel did as Moses had instructed. They asked the Egyptians for clothing and articles of silver and gold. The Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites, and they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth.
He paid them for all that free labor that they...
That was the point I wanted to make just then. This was not robbery. This was not theft. They had worked as slaves for free for generations. They were owed this remuneration. It wasn't necessarily money, but it was clothing and articles of gold and silver. Valuable stuff. That night, the people of Israel left Ramses and started for Succoth. There were about 600,000 men, plus all the women and children. Footnote B, or fighting men. Hebrew reads men on foot. So that would be men, I think in that culture, I think we'll run across it later, age of majority was considered to be 20 at that point, then you were eligible to fight. So this would have been men 20 and older, so any of the rest were considered part of the children. So if you have, oh, who knows what percentage of children to adults, but it could have been close to 50%. Well, let's say you consider children up to 20 and then they lived to 80, so that's about a quarter. Maybe they lived to 100, about a fifth. Let's say about a fifth of the population were children, and you have about as many women as you have men. So you got 600,000 men. A fifth of that would be over 100,000 children. So you got over 100,000 children. So then you would have had a total of 1,200,000 plus the children, another 13, 14, or 1.4 million people. Could have been as high as 1.5 million. That's a lot of people. A rabble of non-Israelites went with them. Now, I don't know if those are considered part of the 600,000 or if they're just in addition to it. If they're in addition to it, then that's an even greater crowd, along with great flocks and herds of livestock. For bread, they baked flat cakes from the dough without yeast they had brought from Egypt. It was made without yeast because the people were driven out of Egypt in such a hurry that they had no time to prepare the bread or other food. The people of Israel had lived in Egypt for 430 years. In fact, it was on the last day of the 430th year that all the Lord's forces left the land. On this night, the Lord kept his promise to bring his people out of the land of Egypt. So this night belongs to him, and it must be commemorated every year by all the Israelites from generation to generation. Now, I've got a footnote C there for Egypt. The Samaritan Pentateuch reads in Canaan and Egypt, and the Greek version reads in Egypt and Canaan. All right.
Now that's horrible, isn't it?
Well, I understand why they might do that, because of the 400 years that was referenced in Genesis. And some think that 400 years began somewhere around that point. 430 years is a long time. But if we count the time that Jacob spent in Canaan, we have what? Another 30 years on top of the 400 to count in Egypt. And that may be why, and it might have been manipulation to get their calendars to work out to we talked about that when we came across the genealogy from Noah down to Abraham, that there are the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek Old Testament put another name in there, and we suggested that might have been to make a certain count of years work out for the Jews at the time that those manuscripts were prepared. So, 430 years, that's pushing 500. That's half a millennium almost. That's a long time. And when the other reason might be, and I think part of this is, when you read through the genealogies of Egypt, and rather of the Israelites. When we read through the genealogies of the Israelites, we'll get into that when we get into the books of Chronicles, which are exceedingly heavy on genealogy. We're going to find that there aren't 400 years worth of generations from the entry into Egypt to the time of Moses and Aaron. Now, part of that may have been that as slaves, they were not able to keep genealogies. Or it may be that, well, maybe we'll talk about that when we get to those things. It seems like there's too few generations for the amount of time that passes. It may be that they didn't keep track, or maybe the time wasn't as long. We're not given certainty on that. We just know that it doesn't seem to add up. Instructions for the Passover, verse 43. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the instructions for the festival of Passover. No outsiders are allowed to eat the Passover meal, but any slave who has been purchased may eat it if he has been circumcised. Temporary residents and hired servants may not eat it. Each Passover lamb must be eaten in one house. Do not carry any of its meat outside, and do not break any of its bones." The whole community of Israel must celebrate this Passover festival. And this bit about not breaking any of its bones, that is what is referred to in the New Testament when they tell the story of the crucifixion. Because the thieves who were crucified along with Jesus, the soldiers came, they weren't dead yet, they broke their legs. With their legs broken, they could not lift themselves, and so in relatively short order, they would suffocate and die. And because of out of Roman consideration for Jewish sensibilities, they did not want to leave bodies hanging on the crosses until over the Sabbath hours. So they would break their legs, they would die, and then they could take them down, and they'd be off for those holy hours. And the Romans apparently agreed to that concession. You were muffled.
I have a question for you.
All right.
I was remembering what happened to me in Marquette, Michigan, right after we got married, and they had the ordinance services. And I was not allowed to partake, even though I was an Adventist and I was attending an Adventist church. I was not allowed to partake in the wafer.
Yeah.
Does that wafer represent anything?
Well, the symbology of the rite of the Lord's Supper, Jesus said, "This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So the wafer would represent the body of Christ.
Okay, so if the body of Christ is broken, and the sheep was supposed to represent the body of Christ, yet it was not to be broken.
The bones were not to be broken. And the New Testament makes a point that when they came to Jesus, it looked like he was already dead, so the soldier took a spear and ran it up under his ribs toward his heart, and out came water and blood. And the officer saw that Jesus was already dead, they didn't need to break his legs, they could just take him down.
Well, I know that before passing out the wafer, the pastor stands up front and breaks the break.
And that's based on the description of the Last Supper, where Jesus broke the bread and gave it to his disciples.
Okay.
The bones were not broken, but Jesus died, so in that sense he was broken. What's the hymn say? Bread of the world in mercy broken. And Jesus did in John chapter 6. He talked to the people that their relationship would have to be so intimate, it would be like eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And he used that metaphor directly. He didn't say it would be like, that's a simile. He said it in metaphor. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. If there are foreigners living, let's see, okay, well, we stopped with do not break any of its bones. So then verse 47, the whole community of Israel must celebrate this Passover festival. If there are foreigners living among you who want to celebrate the Lord's Passover, let all their males be circumcised. Only then may they celebrate the Passover with you like any native-born Israelite. But no uncircumcised male may ever eat the Passover meal. This instruction applies to everyone, whether a native-born Israelite or a foreigner living among you. So all the people of Israel followed the Lord's commands to Moses and Aaron. On that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt like an army. Well, we've got a little time here. Maybe we can do chapter 13 as well. It's shorter. Then the Lord said to Moses, dedicate to me every firstborn among the Israelites. The first offspring to be born of both humans and animals belongs to me. So Moses said to the people, this is a day to remember forever, the day you left Egypt, the place of your slavery. Today the Lord has brought you out by the power of his mighty hand. Remember, eat no food containing yeast. On this day in early spring, in the month of Abib, you have been set free. Footnote for that month name. The Hebrew says, on this day in the month of Abib. This first month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar usually occurs within the months of March and April. We've kind of already discussed that, so that wasn't a really big new thing to us. Today the Lord has brought you out by the power of his mighty hand. Remember, eat no food containing yeast. On this day in early spring, in the month of Abib, you have been set free. You must celebrate this event in this month each year after the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now that time it only names 6. He swore to your ancestors that he would give you this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. For 7 days the bread you eat must be unleavened or made without yeast. Then on the 7th day, celebrate a feast to the Lord. Eat bread without yeast during those 7 days. In fact, there must be no yeast bread or any yeast at all found within the borders of your land during this time. On the seventh day, you must explain to your children, I am celebrating what the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. This annual festival will be a visible sign to you, like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. Let it remind you always to recite this teaching of the Lord. With a strong hand, the Lord rescued you from Egypt. Footnote B on that. Or let it remind you always to keep the instructions of the Lord on the tip of your tongue, because with a strong hand the Lord rescued you from Egypt. Okay. So observe the decree of this festival at the appointed time each year. This is what you must do when the Lord fulfills the promise he swore to you and to your ancestors. When he gives you the land where the Canaanites now live, you must present all firstborn sons and firstborn male animals to the Lord, for they belong to him. A firstborn donkey may be brought back from the Lord, or bought back from the Lord, by presenting a lamb or young goat in its place. But if you do not buy it back, you must break its neck. However, you must buy back every firstborn son. Jesus was a firstborn son, and his parents offered, well, it says they offered a dove or a pair of doves, indicating that they were poor, but that may have been the offering for Mary's cleansing, because it was done later, and not the offering for his relief. And if so, then that's not told to us what Joseph and Mary did about buying back Jesus as their firstborn. And in the future, your children will ask you, what does all this mean? Then you will tell them, with the power of his mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, the place of our slavery. Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, so the Lord killed all the firstborn males throughout the land of Egypt, both people and animals. That is why I now sacrifice all the firstborn males to the Lord, except that the firstborn sons are always bought back. This ceremony will be like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. It is a reminder that the power of the Lord's mighty hand brought us out of Egypt. Now, I see something here that I think might be a precursor to something that we read in Revelation. Here in verse 16, this ceremony will be like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. Now, we talked about that because in the book of Revelation, there is a mark that can be received on the forehead or in the hand, and it was called the mark of the beast. Interestingly here, this ceremony can be on the hand or the forehead, and it's actually a simile here. It's saying this ceremony will be like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. It is a reminder that the power of the Lord's mighty hand brought us out of Egypt. The ceremony itself would not be like the seal of God, which in the book of Revelation was placed only on the forehead. And we, I think at that time, mentioned the symbolism of that in the forehead, that is at the frontal lobe, where we make choices, the seal of God is something that we choose. We don't just do it. If we just do it, it doesn't work. It's only received in the forehead. The mark of the beast can be chosen, or you can just go along and do it. The hand, that's what we use to do things with. We can do things, and it counts when it comes to the mark of the beast. But the
Are
seal
you
of God is only in the forehead.
trying to reach heaven by your good deeds?
Well, if so, it won't work, because you can't receive the seal of God in your hand, only in the forehead. Has to be a choice that you freely make. But this ceremony, this is what I'm finding interesting here. This ceremony will be like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. So, the Israelites could choose to honor God and to honor this mark of their freedom and liberty, kind of like yesterday in our country, the celebration of our Declaration of Independence. This sign of their liberty, they could choose to do it, or they could just go along because that's what everybody was doing. It could be branded on their hand. It is a reminder that the power of the Lord's mighty hand brought us out of Egypt. Israel's wilderness detour. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Sea of Reeds. That's what footnote C is going to tell us there. Then the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. So let's go down and look at those two footnotes. Footnote C was Sea of Reeds, just as I expected. Footnote D, the Greek version reads, left Egypt in the 5th generation. Well, that's interesting. So we're reading what they have taken from the Hebrew, whereas the Greek version would say in the 5th generation. Interesting. Now, that I'm going to challenge even this description here. This bit about if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Remember that Abraham and Isaac both made compacts with the Philistines that they would honor each other and not try to destroy each other. I think that God is leading them in the direction He leads them, not directly through Philistine territory, in order to make sure that there would not be a battle between these people groups, and in part, yes, so they wouldn't lose heart and return to Egypt, but also so that they would, for a time at least, honor the compact that Abraham and Isaac had made with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines.
They didn't have anything to fight with.
Well, no, they probably didn't, and that would be an issue many years later in their battles with the Philistines, where the Philistines would deny them the ability to produce weapons. But no, they probably didn't, and we will be getting to that later in this story as they leave the mountain of God, we call it Mount Sinai, and proceed toward the promised land, and all of what happens in that story. We can talk about that when we get there.
Well, my point is, most likely they didn't have anything to fight with. Now that would not be an issue for God. They don't need something to fight with because God can handle it.
Yeah.
He can send in hornets or something. But the Israelites were not developed enough to understand this, and without a weapon in their hand to defend themselves, they would have lost heart.
Well, like I said, we'll read the story of what happens probably about a year later as they approach the promised land. But for now, yes. I personally don't think God intended them to use military conquest to take over the land. We haven't reached that point in this narrative yet, but when we do, we'll point that out. That was their choice. And it caused lots and lots of trouble for them. God did not intend them to inherit the land of the Philistines. That they, now we have to understand that when the Israelites are busy fighting the Philistines in the days of Saul and David, and even before that, that wasn't entirely the Israelites' fault. That certainly the Philistines themselves bear some of the blame for the fighting that took place between peoples that should have been at peace because of the compact made between Abimelech, Abraham, and Isaac. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear to do this. He said, God will certainly come to help you. When he does, you must take my bones with you from this place. Now remember, when Joseph's father died, he and the Egyptians went to the land of Canaan and buried him and spent quite a bit of time there going through all their ceremonies and rituals of mourning. But when Joseph died, that provision was not made, and his bones stayed there. So Moses takes them with him. The Israelites left Sukkah and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night, and the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. So here's the first reference to that pillar of cloud, which would be helpful in the desert during the day, and a pillar of fire, which would provide light and possibly even warmth, because the desert is a land of extremes. There's very little plant life to moderate the weather, so it gets very hot in the day and very cold at night. That's the double-pronged threat of trying to survive in a desert climate. And they would have been, and I want to call something up here just for map reference, so to speak. We'll take a moment here and look at the map. And of course, when this comes up, it'll take a moment here. It's going to come up to our country and not the place where we want to, but we can get there. So let's see if I can move that off, because I don't really need all those search tools right now, and that'll give you a better view of things. So we're zooming in now on the land of Egypt, and most of Egyptian culture would have been in this territory here, which, as you can see, watered by the Nile, is green compared to the rest of the desert. And so the tradition has the Israelites crossing the Red Sea here on the Gulf of Suez, which leads up to the Suez Canal, which allows ship traffic to pass from the Indian Ocean through into the Red Sea and up into the Mediterranean, and eliminates the need to pass south of the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. So a lot of people think this is where, but if the people were living here and he's leading them out into the desert, they're going through this area. Now, traditionally we place Sinai here in what we call the Sinai Peninsula. In fact, the word's right there, South Sinai Governorate. Okay, South Sinai Governorate. But I'm going to suggest when we get to that part of the story that the crossing of the Red Sea might have happened over here at the Gulf of Aqaba, and we'll zoom in and look at it at that point. But as you can see, they would have left the fertile land, gotten into desert territory, and as we suggest, it may not have been as desert then as it is today, but still, it's desert territory. It would have been not as fertile as this area up in here, which, as you can see, there is more fertile land even today in the modern nation of Israel. So just to look at that for the sake of it, that they're not going through this territory here, which was the territory of the Philistines that God wanted them to avoid. So, and we have reached the end of a chapter, and we have reached our typical hour and a half. So I think this is a good time for us to end this session, and plan to meet with you again next week as we continue through the book of Exodus. So, looking forward to seeing you then, and until then, we wish you goodbye and God bless.
Bye.